Hello, my name is Reese Comprosky, and I worked with Brody Bertone, Melissa Gonzalez, Hannah Hussey, and Paola Montanez on this project about deaf art forms, including media, literature, and paintings. Deaf culture is centered on a shared community made up of traditions, values, and common experiences. One of the biggest parts of deaf culture is visual communication, which is why things like facial expression, body language, and eye contact are so important. It also emphasizes strong social connections and pride in deaf identity. Many deaf individuals do not see being deaf as a disability. Instead, they see it as an important part of who they are and as a connection to a larger cultural community. American Sign Language, or ASL, is a full language with its own grammar and sentence structure. It uses several important features to create meaning, including hand shapes, movement, palm orientation, location, and facial expressions. Another important point is that ASL is not universal, because different countries and regions have their own sign languages. ASL is a major part of communication in the deaf community and is also closely tied to identity and culture. DIVA stands for Deaf View Image of Art and refers to artwork created by deaf artists that focuses on deaf experiences and deaf culture. This type of art is important because it communicates the deaf community's perspectives, including their struggles, achievements, and cultural pride. There are two main types of diva art. The first is resistance art, which shows challenges that deaf people have faced, such as oppression, frustration, or exclusion. The second is affirmative art, which focuses on the positive aspects of deaf identity, including pride, language, community, and culture. Examples of both of these types of art are shown on the right half of this slide. Together, these forms of art help express what life and identity can look like within the deaf community.
In the next few slides, I will expand on the origins and themes within resistance art and affirmative art. Deaf history is marked by several protests against oppression. The first political movement in deaf history happened in the Milan Conference in 1880, where the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf banned sign language in favor of spoken language. This ban was also reflected in the United States, making it relevant to deaf culture in America. This conference did not invite deaf educators, causing outrage throughout the deaf community as representation and accessibility were undermined and removed. This action resulted in the founding of the National Association for the Deaf, or NAD, led by deaf people to advocate for deaf rights and sign language. This organization remains prevalent today as a leading force in real progress for deaf rights and accessibility across the country and the world. One influential piece of resistance art, as you can see on this slide here, is called You Sign, You Die by Call. And it shows a terrified deaf child holding grenades in his hands, which depicts the repression of sign language in favor of speech. The feather forced in front of the child's mouth represents one method of oralism taught. While this practice is no longer applicable in today's age, many deaf people are subjected to using cochlear implants. This comes from the hearing perspective that deafness is something in need of being fixed, rather than legitimizing the deaf community as having its own culture and identity. One of the earliest movements affirming deaf culture was the U.S. Rehabilitation Act in 1973. This law states that no one for reason of disability should be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. This resulted in mandatory enforcement of ASL interpreters for deaf federal employees. This also paved the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which protects employees from discrimination on the basis of disability and mandates action to ensure public accommodations and accessibility for transportation and telecommunication. For the deaf community, this includes ASL interpreters in legal, medical, and educational settings. One notable example of affirmative art comes from Deafhood Unleashed by Call, displayed on the slide, which affirms deaf culture and sign language. Here, handcuffs are broken for the deaf person from the cuffs of oppression. Sign language is embraced in a butterfly. This piece represents that through civil liberties, deaf people can rejoice in pride in their culture with less fear of discrimination and explore the beauty within sign language and deaf symbols. We also wanted to take the time to acknowledge influential people to the deaf community. First, Laurent Clerc and Thomas Hopkins Claudette. Clerc was a deaf French teacher who Thomas Hopkins came across and searched for a way to teach deaf children in Connecticut. After some time together, both went to the US. Both established the first school for the deaf, now known as the American School for the Deaf. Clerk's influence paved the way for American Sign Language today, and Gallaudet's contributions to deaf education became foundational to deaf schools throughout the United States. He is the namesake for Gallaudet University, a university for the deaf. Another significant figure in the deaf community is Helen Keller, a deaf-blind American author and activist. While many of her contributions focused on the blind community, she is one of the most renowned influences for American deaf culture. She pushed for several disability rights and social justice to demand proper accessibility. She was also a co-founder for the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization dedicated to defending rights and liberties based on the U.S. Constitution. Her perseverance to learn sign, despite struggling, and her advocacy for communities with disabilities makes her a notable influence to consider.
We will be now talking about a few key points in the history of deaf media. Deaf media is media created by the deaf community, and it aims to visually represent deaf experiences using authentic representation, accessibility, and deaf cultural values and perspectives. In 1880, the first International Conference of Deaf Educators was held. It came to the conclusion that oralism was superior to sign language. This led to the ban of sign language in education, leading to a decline in deaf writers, lawyers, and artists, and having an impact on deaf expression. In 1910, a 15-minute film by George W. Vaditz conveyed the message of protecting sign language. It was thought to be the noblest gift God gave to deaf people. This was the pivotal time in deaf media as sign language was becoming a lost art due to its previous ban. In 1967, the National Theater of the Deaf was founded in Connecticut, and it showcased the blending of ASL with spoken English to mainstream stages. This brought attention to the richness of sign language, and it led to wider accessibility efforts such as caption media and sign language interpreters. In 1988, there was a Deaf President Now movement held in Gallaudet University. It was an 8-day protest to remove the newly appointed president who was of hearing. Students demanded a deaf president and a greater representation at the world's only liberal arts university for the deaf and hard of hearing. This movement gained positive media coverage as a moment of empowerment, leading to the surge of deaf pride. In 2021, CODA won 3 Oscars. CODA, standing for Child of Deaf Adults, became a major milestone in deaf media, as it was an authentic representation of the lives of CODAs involving deaf actors. This was a powerful movie that showcased ASL as a natural, bright language used in everyday life instead of as a disability. So, when it comes to deaf media, there are some guidelines and key features that help it be very authentic and accessible for those in the deaf community. And some of those guidelines are accessibility and inclusion. This could mean using captions, making sure that the deaf community are the primary audience, not just an afterthought. Another one would be visual center storytelling. This means using facial expressions, body language, and ASL, not just spoken dialogue. And we also have firsthand experiences, which is what really helps to have that authenticity in deaf media and bringing those firsthand experiences to life and to help avoid stereotypes in the deaf community and outside of it. Some examples in media are Coda. It uses deaf actors and shows the dynamics of a deaf family in a realistic way. The Daily Moth is also a great example of news created in ASL for the deaf community. And on the right, we also have a picture of Marley Matlin, who is a major role in advocating for authentic representation in media. The overall impact of deaf media is that it really does increase the visibility of deaf community. It educates hearing audiences, and it breaks down those misconceptions by showing deaf people as complex individuals, not just people who are defined by their hearing status. Now we'll be talking about deaf culture appropriation, and this happens when elements of deaf culture are misrepresented and used by hearing people without involving deaf individuals, authentic ideas, and without credit. And so one of the ways that this may look like is hear washing, which is when hearing actors are casted for deaf roles, and this could also mean autism, which is when speech is preferred over sign language or ASL. And another example of this would be using ASL for aesthetic purposes, like in performances or social media, without understanding the language or giving credit to its cultural significance. Some examples of cultural appropriation in movies are The Silence and the Wonderstruck movie. Both of these movies faced a lot of criticism for these kinds of issues in casting hearing actors for deaf roles and how they portrayed deaf characters in their movies. Deaf cultural appropriation has a very big impact on the community as it limits opportunities for deaf actors, writers, and creators, and it can also shape the way that society views deaf individuals, which means enforcing those stereotypes or inaccuracies that the deaf community faces. So, some ways that we can do moving forward is um, hiring more deaf actors, writers, and directors to be part of the creative process of movies or TV shows or theater shows. And this also means prioritizing deaf perspectives and input in storytelling for a very authentic representation. This isn't just about who is on the screen, but also who is behind the scenes making these decisions.
Hi, my name is Hannah Hussey, and I'm going to be talking about deaf literature and deaf painting/designs. So, first, what is deaf literature? Deaf literature includes stories, poetry, plays, and essays that reflect deaf culture and lived experiences. It can be shared through written English or through ASL video performances. Many works often explore identity, communication, community, language, and overcoming barriers. The types of deaf literature include ASL literature, which includes poetry, storytelling, and performances in American Sign Language. Another type is written deaf literature, which includes books, essays, memoirs, and poems written about deaf life and culture. Why it matters. Deaf literature helps preserve deaf history and experiences, educates hearing audiences, and promotes pride and representation within the deaf community. Deaf paintings and design are important forms of deaf visual art. Deaf visual art includes paintings, murals, digital design, photography, posters, and mixed media. These forms allow artists to express experiences and ideas in visual ways. Common themes in deaf art include identity, community, communication, accessibility, pride, and empowerment. Many deaf artists use their work to share personal experiences and bring awareness to issues that affect the deaf community. An example artist is Nancy Rourke. She uses bold colors and symbolism in her artwork. Her work often explores deafhood, identity, and human rights. The painting shown here is called Like a River. In the painting, the left side is the deaf world with fingerspelling DEAF. The right side is the hearing world with a deaf person learning how to talk and listen. The river is the deaf girl. Deaf paintings and design matter because they give visibility to deaf voices, educate hearing audiences, and celebrate deaf culture.
Hi, my name is Brody Bertone, and I focused on the deaf presence in Gainesville, Florida. And Gainesville has a growing deaf presence, largely influenced by the University of Florida. There's ASL classes and student organizations like Signing Gators to help promote deaf culture and awareness. There are also interpreting services and accessibility resources available, especially in education and as well in healthcare. Gainesville might not be as large of a city with established deaf hubs, but it still provides meaningful opportunities for connection, learning, and advocacy within the deaf community. We have a few potential action plans that go hand in hand with one another. One strong opportunity is partnering with the Harn Art Museum here at the University of Florida to create exhibits centered on deaf culture and artistic expression. These exhibits could highlight deaf artists, especially those involved with DeVia, which focuses on deaf identity and lived experiences. By working with student organizations like Signing Gators and inviting deaf artists or speakers, the museum can ensure the exhibits are both authentic and community driven. Accessibility will be a key part of this effort. This means offering ASL interpreted tours and captioned videos and interactive visual displays so that both deaf and hearing visitors can fully engage with the content. The goal is not just to display art, but to create an inclusive space that educates the Gainesville community about deaf culture and in a meaningful way. To make this project realistic, funding could come from several sources. Signing Gators could host fundraisers like events and merchandise sales, and then we can also have additional support come from GoFundMe's or other campus crowdfunding efforts, as well as university grants that focus on student initiatives and diversity programs. Together, these funding strategies make the project both feasible and sustainable while supporting deaf representation in art.
These are the sources we derived our research from for this project. Thank you for watching.